The morning started like any other at Adelaide Cottage in Windsor. The sun had barely climbed past the old oak trees when the household began to stir. Prince William was already awake, standing in the kitchen in a simple grey jumper, filling the kettle with water. He hadn't slept well. He rarely did on days like this, days when something was quietly sitting on his heart. Something he hadn't yet found the words for. Kate was upstairs. She had been moving slowly that week, not in a worrying way, but in the way a person moves when they are carrying something invisible. She had been quieter than usual, more thoughtful, pausing in the middle of conversations as if a memory had just floated past her. She was trying to catch it before it disappeared. William had noticed. He always noticed, even when he said nothing. Their 3 children, George. Charlotte and Louis had already made their presence known. Louis had been the first to thunder down the stairs, his socks sliding on the wooden floor as he turned the corner into the hallway. Charlotte had followed soon after, sensible and bright-eyed, immediately asking what was for breakfast. George had come last, still looking half asleep but trying very hard to appear older than his years. The way eldest children often do, William made the tea without being asked. He made it exactly the way Kate liked, not too strong, a small splash of milk, no sugar. He set the mug on the counter and looked at it for a moment. He had made that same cup of tea thousands of times over the years. It was such a small thing, and yet on mornings like this one, he understood that small things were everything. He had been thinking for weeks about something he wanted to do, not a grand gesture, not a ceremony or a speech or anything that would ever appear in a newspaper. It was something private, something that belonged only to the 2 of them. He had been waiting for the right moment, and the truth was, he wasn't entirely sure when that moment would come. He just knew he would recognize it when it arrived. The children ate their breakfast with the usual noise, an energy that came with being young and full of life. Louis knocked over his orange juice almost immediately, which surprised no one. Charlotte helped clean it up with the kind of quiet efficiency that always made. William thinks she was going to be remarkable someday. Not that she wasn't already. George sat at the end of the table, reading something on a small piece of paper he'd brought down from his room. He was very focused, very serious. Kate came downstairs while the chaos was still swirling. She was wearing a soft blue cardigan over a white shirt, her hair loosely pulled back, and she looked, as she almost always did, even on the quietest mornings, completely lovely. Not in a dressed-up, formal way. In a real way. In the way that William had fallen in love with all those years ago in a university corridor, before either of them had any idea what their lives would become. She smiled when she saw the mug of tea already waiting. She picked it up without a word and wrapped both hands around it. Their eyes met across the kitchen, and he gave her a small nod, the kind of nod that carries an entire paragraph inside it. She understood it. She always did. After the children were settled and breakfast was cleared, William asked if she would take a short walk with him. Just the 2 of them. He said it casually, as if it were nothing, but there was something in his voice that made Kate look at him a little more carefully. She agreed, pulling on her coat and slipping her feet into the worn garden boots she kept by the back door. They walked out into the cool morning air, crossing the garden toward the narrow path that wound behind the cottage and into the quiet stretch of land beyond the hedgerows. The world was very still out there. A few birds moved through the branches overhead. The grass was slightly damp underfoot. Their breath came out in thin clouds in the cold air. William didn't say anything for a while. He walked beside her with his hands in his pockets, looking ahead, collecting himself. Kate walked quietly beside him, not pressing, not asking. She had always understood that he needed time to arrive at the things that mattered most to him. It was one of the many ways she knew him that no one else ever could. It was only when they reached the old wooden gate at the far end of the path, the one that opened onto a forgotten field that the children had claimed as their own private kingdom on summer afternoons, that William stopped. He turned to face her. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out something small. It was folded carefully, a piece of paper worn at the edges as though it had been handled many times. Kate looked at it. Then she looked at him. Her expression shifted, just slightly. Just enough in the way it does when something unexpected and tender lands in the middle of an ordinary moment. She hadn't been expecting this. She didn't know what it was, but she could already feel, in the way only a person who truly loves another person can feel, that whatever was inside that folded paper mattered enormously. William held it out to her without a word. His jaw was tight. His eyes were steady, but not entirely. There was a softness there that he usually kept tucked away, not out of coldness, but out of habit, out of years of learning to hold himself together in public. Out here, in the quiet field, in the cold morning air, with no one watching, he let it show. Kate reached out and took the paper from his hand. Her fingers brushed against his briefly. She looked down at it, then back up at him once more, reading his face the way she had read it for over 20 years. She saw something there she hadn't seen in a long time. Something open. Something unguarded. She began to unfold the paper slowly. The paper had been folded 4 times. Kate opened it carefully, so she already understood without knowing why, that whatever was inside deserved to be treated gently. The first crease, then the second. William stood perfectly still, watching her face the way a person watches a candle flame in a dark room, attentive to every flicker. What she found inside was not what she had expected. It wasn't a letter exactly. It was something closer to a list, but not the kind of list anyone would ever make for practical reasons. It was handwritten in William's familiar, slightly cramped script. The kind of handwriting that looked in a hurry, but was always perfectly legible. The ink was blue. Some words were written more firmly than others, as if pressed harder when the feeling behind them was stronger at the top. In letters slightly larger than the rest were 5 words, "Things I have never said." Kate stood very still. The wind moved gently through the hedgerow beside them. A single leaf came loose and drifted down between them, landing on the damp grass without a sound. She read slowly. She was not a person who rushed through things that mattered. The first item on the list was something small, so small it might have seemed insignificant to anyone else. It was about a morning many years ago, long before they were married. When she had shown up unexpectedly at his door during a particularly dark stretch of time in his life, she hadn't called ahead. She hadn't asked if it was a good time. She had simply come carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing a coat 2 sizes too large. And she had sat with him for hours without asking him to explain anything or fix anything or be anything other than exactly what he was in that moment. He had never told her how much that had meant to him. Not properly. Not in words. Kate's throat tightened. She remembered that day clearly. She had second-guessed herself the whole way there. Wondering if she was overstepping? Wondering if she should have called first? She hadn't known until right now, standing in a field behind their home with cold air on her cheeks, that it had stayed with him the way it had apparently stayed with him. She moved to the next item. This one was about a photograph. It wasn't a famous photograph. It had never been published anywhere. It's never seen by anyone outside a small circle of people who had been present that day. It was a photograph taken at a private family gathering when Charlotte was just a few months old. In the photograph, Kate was laughing at something entirely ordinary. Someone had said something mildly funny. Nothing remarkable, and William had looked at her in that moment. Not at the camera, not at Charlotte, not at anyone else in the room. He had looked at her, and something in his chest had done something he didn't have a name for. He had quietly asked someone to take the photograph. He had kept it. He had looked at it more times than he could count. He had never told her about the photograph. He had never told her what it had meant to him, or that it existed, or that there were evenings when he came across it by accident and it reminded him in the most uncomplicated way, right, of exactly why he had chosen the life he had chosen. Kate lowered the paper for a moment. She looked out across the small field, where the grass was pale and silver with morning damp. She was blinking, not quickly, but deliberately. Ain't the way a person does when they are trying to hold something in, while also needing to let it breathe. William watched her. He hadn't moved from the spot where he was standing. His hands were still in his pockets, but his shoulders had dropped. He looked younger, somehow, than he had that morning in the kitchen. He looked the way he had looked at university, before duty and grief and the relentless weight of a very public life had layered themselves, one by one, over the boy he had once been. She looked back at the paper. There were more items. Each one was its own small world. One was about her laugh, not the polished, Cameretti smile the world recognized, but the real laugh, The one that came out when she was genuinely caught off guard. The one that started somewhere in her chest and arrived at her face slightly delayed and always slightly surprised her. He had written that no matter how heavy a day had been, that laugh had a way of making everything recalibrate. He had never said this to her. It had lived inside him, quiet and certain, for years. Another was about the children. He had written about a specific evening, George's first week of school, and he had come home quieter than usual and hadn't wanted to talk about it. Kate had not pushed. She had simply sat beside him on the floor of his bedroom, both of them leaning against the bed. And she had started telling him a story, not a book, not something she'd read, but something she was making up as she went, quietly and without drama, until he had gradually leaned into her side and eventually fallen asleep. William had stood in the doorway and watched the whole thing without either of them knowing he was there. He had written, "I have never told you that in that moment I knew, without any doubt, that you were the best person I have ever known." Kate pressed her hand flat against the page, not gripping it, just resting her hand on it, as if the words needed to be steadied. The cold air moved around them. Somewhere far across the field, a bird called out once and then went quiet. The whole world felt very far away. The cameras, the schedules, the careful management of a life lived largely in public view. All of it had receded completely, and what remained was just the two of them, standing beside an old wooden gate, the way they might have stood 20 years ago, before any of it, when they were simply two young people figuring out what love meant in the long run. William spoke for the first time since handing her the paper. His voice was quiet, unhurried. "I should have said all of it a long time ago," he said. "I'm not good at saying things. You know that?" Kate didn't answer immediately. She was still looking at the page, but her lips moved just slightly, just enough in something that was almost a smile, but was also something else entirely. Something deeper than a smile. Something that didn't have a simple name. She folded the paper back along its original creases, taking her time, and held it carefully in both hands. The silence between them was not empty. It was full, so full it was almost visible, like something that could be touched if you reached for it. She turned to face him in whatever she was about to say. She held for one more moment, letting the weight of the morning settle around them both. William waited. He had learned over many years that the best things Kate said were always worth waiting for. She said his name first. Just his name, softly, the way she had said it on the very first night they had talked properly. Sitting in a crowded university common room, while everyone around them laughed at something neither of them could later remember. Just his name, in that particular way she had of saying it that made it sound like a complete sentence. Then she said, "How long have you been carrying this around?" He looked at the folded paper in her hands, and then back at her face. "A while," he said, which was not an answer, and they both knew it, but it was honest in the way that understatements sometimes are. The truth was that some of what was written on that page had been living inside him for more than a decade. Some of it for longer. He had never been someone who found it easy to speak about the things that mattered most. The bigger the feeling, the harder it seemed to find a door for it. Kate nodded slowly. She understood this about him better than anyone. She had never tried to change it, never pushed him to perform an emotional openness he wasn't ready for. That patience, quiet, undemanding, and absolutely real, had been one of the foundations of everything they had built together. "You didn't have to write it down," she said. "But I'm glad you did," he exhaled. Not dramatically, just the small release of a breath held too long. "I didn't know how else to do it," he admitted. She took a step toward him. He didn't move back. The distance between them, already small, became something closer to nothing. She looked up at him with an expression that was difficult to describe because it was made of several things at once. Tenderness, recognition, a kind of quiet joy, and underneath all of it, something steadier than any of those. Something that had been tested and bent and weathered and had held. "The morning I came to your door," she said. "With the coffee, yes," he said. "I almost didn't come," she told him. "I stood outside the building for about 10 minutes, trying to decide whether it was a good idea." He blinked. He hadn't known that. In all the years since, in all the times that morning had surfaced in his memory, he had imagined her arriving with certainty, with the kind of quiet confidence that was so natural to her. The idea that she had stood outside uncertain, deciding, made something shift inside him. It made the gesture larger, somehow not smaller. "Why did you come in the end?" he asked. She smiled then. "A real one, slow and unhurried? Because I thought, if he's having a bad day, he probably needs someone to be there more than he needs the door to stay closed." He was quiet for a moment. The field stretched out around them, ordinary and still, brown grass and bare hedgerow and pale winter sky. It looked nothing like anywhere remarkable. And yet he suspected he would remember this morning for the rest of his life. "I think about that more than you know," he said. She held the folded paper a little tighter. Not nervously. There was nothing nervous about Kate when she was on solid ground. And she was absolutely on solid ground now. She held it the way a person holds something they intend to keep. They started walking again. Not back toward the house, but further along the path. Instinctively, without discussion. The way do people walk when they are not ready for a conversation to end? The ground was uneven in places, frost-stiffened grass giving way to softer patches of mud near the base of the hedgerow. Their footsteps were the only sound for a while. William spoke again after a few minutes. He told her about the photograph, the real version of the story, not the written one. He described where he had been standing, what the light had been like, the exact expression on her face, and what it had done to him. He was more articulate when talking than he was when writing, in the way some people are. And his description of that moment was precise enough that she could see it clearly, even though she had no memory of being looked at. In that way, she listened without interrupting. This was something Kate did that had taken William years to fully appreciate. She listened to the whole thing, not just the easy parts. Not just the parts that were straightforward. She listened to the beginning and the middle and the end. And she let the meaning of it settle before she responded. When he finished, she said, "I remember that day. I remember what I was wearing. I had no idea you were looking at me like that. You never do," he said. And there was something rueful and warm in the way he said it. Not a complaint. A kind of fond disbelief that had never quite faded. She laughed, and there it was. That laugh. The real one, the one from the list. The one that started somewhere in her chest and arrived slightly delayed. It moved through the cold morning air, and it did exactly what he had written that it always did. It made everything else recalibrate. He smiled. Properly, fully, the kind of smile that belonged to a different version of him than the one the world usually saw. The cameras had their version of his smile. Kate had this one. They walked further until they reached a small wooden bench that someone had placed at the edge of the field years before they had ever lived there. It faced east, which meant that on clear mornings it caught the first real light. They sat down on it together, their shoulders close, and looked out at the pale winter landscape in front of them. Kate unfolded the paper one more time. She read through it again, slowly from the beginning. William sat beside her and did not look at the page. He already knew what it said. He looked instead at the way the light was starting to change in the eastern sky, thin and clear and silver. The kind of winter light that made everything look as though it had been outlined very carefully. When she reached the last item on the list, the one about the evening with George, the one that ended with, "I have never told you that in that moment I knew, without any doubt, that you were the best person I have ever known," she stopped reading. She folded the paper once carefully, then she leaned her head against his shoulder. He didn't say anything. He simply adjusted slightly, so that the angle was more comfortable for her, a small, practiced, completely unconscious movement of a person long accustomed to being leaned on and glad of it. They sat like that for a while. The sky continued to lighten. The cold sat around them without bothering them. Neither of them had anywhere to be in the next. A few minutes that mattered more than this. It was Kate who eventually broke the silence. She lifted her head and looked at him, and her eyes were bright. Not from crying, not yet, though. That was nearby, but from something else. From the particular brightness that comes to a person's eyes when they have just been seen, truly seen, by someone who knows them completely. "I want to write you one too," she said. He turned to look at her. He hadn't expected that. Of all the things she might have said in response to the morning he had planned so carefully, This was not one he had imagined. "You don't have to," he said. "I know I don't have to," she said. "That's not why I want to." The bench creaked softly as she shifted beside him, tucking her hands into her coat pockets. The faintest color had begun to touch the horizon. Somewhere behind the hedgerow, the birds were starting to find their voices again, one by one. In the careful way birds begin a morning, testing the air, deciding it is safe, gradually filling the silence with something bright and unhurried. William looked at the horizon and felt something loosen in his chest that had been wound tight for longer than he could easily remember. They walked back to the house without rushing. The path that had felt slightly ceremonious on the way out felt different on the return, more settled, more ordinary in the best possible sense. The extraordinary thing about a morning like this one was that it did not try to announce itself. It simply arrived quietly and without ceremony, and left both of them altered in ways that were difficult to point to, but impossible to miss. The children were still inside. Louis had found something that needed fixing, or at least, he had found something that he believed needed fixing, which was a slightly different matter, and Charlotte was helping him with the focused, slightly exasperated patience of a younger sister who has been assigned the role of sensible one and takes it seriously. George was on the sofa with a book, genuinely reading at this time, his legs folded underneath him, his face arranged in the expression of deep concentration that made him look in unguarded moments like these. Startlingly, like his father at the same age, Kate stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping inside, watching the three of them. William came to stand just behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. Neither of them spoke. The scene in front of them was entirely unremarkable. 3 children in a living room on a slow morning, and entirely irreplaceable. Both of these things were true at once, and both of them knew it. Louis looked up first. "You were gone for ages," he announced, with the particular confidence of a youngest child who considers himself the reliable timekeeper of the household. "It was 20 minutes, Charlotte said, without looking up from whatever she was helping him fix. "It felt longer," Louis said, which closed the matter as far as he was concerned. Kate laughed and came inside, and the morning folded back into its ordinary shape, breakfast cups to rinse, coats to hang up, a small disagreement between Louis and Charlotte that resolved itself before either parent needed to intervene. The house was warm. The kettle went on again. William sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and watched his family move through the familiar rhythms of a Saturday morning. And for a while he just sat there and let himself feel it, all of it, unedited, without the usual quiet monitoring of how he was presenting himself or what the next obligation was. The paper was upstairs now. Kate had folded it and placed it in the pocket of her cardigan before they came back inside, close to her, the way a person carries something they are not ready to put down yet. That afternoon, while William was out with the children, a walk to a nearby stretch of field where Louis had recently become passionately interested in trying to identify birds, a hobby that lasted approximately 45 minutes before he became more interested in a stick, Kate sat at the small writing desk in the corner of the bedroom. She had found a piece of paper and a pen. She sat for a moment with both of them and simply thought. Not with difficulty, the thoughts were there. They had always been there, but with the particular care of a person who understands that some things deserve to be written down properly. She had always been more comfortable with words than William was. She had always known how to say the things that needed to be said, in the right order, at the right time. But this was different from a speech or a toast or a kind note to someone having a hard time. This was for him. And the closeness of it made her want to get it right. She wrote without stopping, the way you write when the words have been waiting. She wrote about the early days, about what it had been like to love him, before anyone in the world knew she loved him. When it was entirely private and entirely theirs, she wrote about the difficulty of that, the loneliness of it on certain days, but also the strange beauty of it, of loving someone in secret, which means loving them without any audience, without any performance, with nothing to prove to anyone. She wrote that she had never stopped being grateful that she had had that time with him. That unobserved version of the beginning of everything. She wrote about the morning of their wedding. Not the ceremony, not the dress, not any of the things the world had seen. She wrote about 10 minutes before she left the hotel, when she had stood alone in the room for a moment. Everyone else briefly elsewhere had thought not about the crowds or the cameras or the magnitude of what was about to happen, but simply and completely about him, about the specific person she was going to, about the fact that when she got to the end of the aisle, he would be standing there, and he would look at her. And however extraordinary the setting, what she would feel in that moment would be exactly what she had felt the first time. She had realized she was in love with him, that particular, unmistakable knowledge that sits in your chest like something warm and certain and entirely beyond argument. She wrote about the years that had been hard. She did not avoid them. She wrote about the grief they had both carried, sometimes together, and sometimes in ways that were slightly out of step with each other. The way grief often works in couples, one person surfacing while the other descends, reaching back across the gap to hold on. She wrote that she had never once, during any of the hardest stretches, doubted that they would find their way back to the same side. She did not write this as a compliment. She wrote it as a fact, because it had always been a fact. She wrote about the children, but differently from the way William had. He had written about a moment he had watched. She wrote about what it had felt like from the inside, the first time she had held George. In those first private minutes before the world was told, the particular silence of that room, the weight of a person you have not yet met, but already loved completely. She wrote that in that moment she had looked up and found William looking at her, and the expression on his face had been one she had never seen on him before and had never forgotten. Open and afraid and overwhelmed and certain, all of it at once, and it had struck her that she was probably wearing the exact same expression, and that somehow that made it even more right. She wrote one final thing. She wrote that she hoped he knew, not as an abstract courtesy, but as something real and specific and true. That whatever the years ahead held, whatever came, whatever they were asked to carry, or to give, or to endure, she would rather carry it with him than set it down without him. That this was not a sacrifice. That this had never been a sacrifice. That it was simply what she chose every day. Including today, she signed it with just her name, the same way he had signed the list he had given her. First name only. Nothing else needed. She folded it in the same way he had folded his, for careful folds, and held it in her hands for a moment, before placing it on the pillow on his side of the bed, where he would find it when the day was done. Then she went downstairs to start dinner, moving quietly through the house, and if there was a brightness about her that hadn't been there when she woke up, she kept it to herself, tucked it inside, carried it the way she carried most of the things that mattered most, not invisibly, but privately, where it was safe, where it was hers. Where it was theirs outside, she could hear William and the children coming back across the garden. Louis was shouting something about a bird he had seen, his voice carrying clearly through the cold afternoon air. Charlotte's voice followed, offering a calm correction. George said something that made William laugh, the real laugh, not the public one, and the sound of it reached her through the kitchen window, familiar and dear. Like a word in a language she had known all her life, she smiled to herself and reached for the pot on the stove. The evening settled over Adelaide Cottage the way evenings did in that season, gradually. Without announcement, the light thinning and going amber before giving way to a soft, complete darkness that had nothing harsh about it. The children had been fed and bathed and argued their usual cases for staying up 15 minutes longer. The usual terms were negotiated, the usual small concessions made. And one by one, the lights in the upstairs bedrooms went on, and then, slowly, off. William was the one who did the final check, a habit so ingrained it had stopped being deliberate, and simply become part of who he was. He looked in on Louis first. The youngest had fallen asleep in a position that defied comfortable explanation, sideways across the bed with one arm hanging off the edge, and a very small expression of outrage still visible on his sleeping face, as though even in sleep he was making a point about something. William straightened the blanket over him without waking him, which required a particular kind of careful, slow movement that he had become expert in over years of practice. Charlotte had her reading light on. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway, serious-eyed and unsurprised, and said good night in the composed way she had of doing most things. He told her 10 more minutes. She said she knew. He believed her. He left the door slightly open the way she liked. George was already asleep. His book on the pillow beside him, as though he'd intended to put it down on the bedside table and hadn't quite made it. William set it aside carefully, checked that the window was properly closed against the cold, and stood for a moment at the foot of the bed. The eldest, the one who would one day carry a weight that William understood better than most, because he carried a version of it himself. He looked at his son's sleeping face, still so young, still so entirely a child, in the unguarded, private way that children only fully are when they are asleep, and felt the familiar, complicated mixture of love and protectiveness and a quiet, serious hope. He pulled the door behind him. The landing was quiet. Kate had come upstairs a little while before him. He could see the light from under their bedroom door, warm and low, the lamp on her side of the bed. He stood on the landing for a moment in the near dark and breathed. The house was still. All 3 children were safe and sleeping. The world outside was dark and cold and far away. This the particular silence of a house where everyone is home and accounted for was something he had never taken for granted and hoped he never would. He opened the bedroom door. Kate was sitting up against the pillows, a book in her lap but not reading it. She was looking at the door when he came in, almost as though she had heard him on the landing and had been waiting, which she had. She had been aware of the precise sound of his footsteps moving from room to room for the better part of 15 years. She could have told you which child he'd checked in on last, and roughly how long he'd spent in each room. Just from listening, he didn't notice the paper on his pillow immediately. He set his phone on the dresser, took off his watch, rolled his sleeves back down. Ordinary, quiet, the movements of a person at the end of a long day. He sat on the edge of the bed, exhaled, and then reached back to pull back the duvet on his side, and stopped. The folded paper was pale against the white of the pillow. He looked at it. Then he looked at Kate. Her expression was calm, not waiting for a reaction, not performing anything. She was simply there, watching him find it. The way she had been simply there for most of the things that had mattered. He picked it up. His hands were careful with it. The way his hands had been careful with things that belonged to her for as long as he could remember. He looked at the 4 neat folds, identical to his own. Something moved in his face, just briefly. Just the faintest shift, before he settled into stillness again. He unfolded it slowly. He read the way he did most things, steadily, without rushing, taking it in properly the first time so that he wouldn't have to revisit it with confusion. Kate sat beside him and did not look at the page. She had already said everything on it. She didn't need to read it over his shoulder. She watched his face instead. He read through the whole thing without speaking. She saw his jaw shift slightly when he reached the part about the early days, about loving him in secret, before the world knew. She saw his chin dip almost imperceptibly at the part about the morning of their wedding, about standing alone in the hotel room and thinking only of him. She watched him reach the last paragraph, the one she had written most carefully, and she saw him stop there. Not to reread it, she thought, just to let it land. When he finished, he held the paper in both hands the same way she had held his, out in the field that morning, resting it, steadying it. He looked up at her. His eyes were very quiet. There was no performance in them, no management, no careful consideration of how he appeared. They were just eyes, his eyes looking at her with everything that was there and nothing held back. He said, "How long have you been carrying this?" It was exactly what she had asked him that morning beside the gate, and they both knew it. And neither of them said anything about the symmetry of it. She smiled quietly, without looking away. "A while," she said, which was not an answer, and they both knew that too. He laughed. A short, soft sound, the kind that comes not from something funny exactly, but from the relief of being known completely. He folded the paper back along its folds, the same for creases, and set it on the bedside table on his side, next to his watch. Where he would see it in the morning, where it would stay, the lamp on her side was still on. Outside the windows, the winter dark was complete. Somewhere an owl moved through the cold air over the fields. The house settled around them, old wood and quiet rooms. The sounds of a home where people live real lives and not performed ones. Kate reached over and turned off the lamp. The room fell into a gentle darkness, not absolute. The faint light from a distant garden lamp came through the curtains. Pale and thin, just enough to see by. He reached across and found her hand. She turned her hand over and held his back, and they lay there in the quiet dark. The paper on the bedside table, the children sleeping, the year turning slowly outside the windows. No cameras, no crowded rooms, no obligations waiting to be met. Just two people who had chosen each other a long time ago and were still, after everything, choosing each other still. Not out of duty, not out of circumstance. Out of the plainest and most enduring reason there is. Because when you are with the right person, the ordinary days become the ones you hold most carefully. Because love in its truest form is not the grand gesture left out in the cold morning air. It is the folded piece of paper. It is the cup of tea made the right way without being asked. It is knowing someone's footsteps in the dark, and turning your hand over when they reach for it, and it being the most natural thing in the world. The night passed quietly around them, and they slept, and the house held them, and outside the cold moved gently over the fields. And the world for once asked nothing of them at all.